Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of eSig. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on eSig. For those of you not familiar with eSig, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. I also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, the GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. eSig leads Pillar 1 of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for the system operators. More information on the GPST can be found at globalpst.org. We had a great in-person fall technical workshop at the end of October in Minneapolis with temperatures in the mid-70s and attendance of 170 persons. What more could you ask for? This was more than double the attendance at our spring workshop in Tucson, so we're well on the way to our pre-COVID levels of attendance. Our next workshop will be in March in Tucson, and I've been promised that the temperatures there will be even better. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the eSig website. If you're new to eSig, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. eSig membership will give you an opportunity to participate actively in all of our working groups and task forces. You can find us on the web at esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. The Q&A, we have moved to the Slido platform, and we're asking you to ask your questions through Slido. So go to slido.com and enter eSig13 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of this screen. You will see a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions submitted. We plan to save 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end, and then wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay, so today's topic will be on the wonderful world of modeling inverter-based resources. This is a topic we've been talking about for the last 20 years or more, and as you will hear in today's webinar, it's a topic we need to do more than talk about. It's a topic we need to do something about. After the California PV disturbance events beginning 5 years ago and continuing through this year, the time on the clock is running out. It was only a month ago that we had Patrick Gravois from ERCOT here talking with us about the Odessa events in Texas. And a year ago, almost to the day, that Ryan Quint was here with us speaking about a similar topic. Ryan Quint, Director of Engineering and Security Integration at NERC, is back with us again to present today's webinar. Ryan, in his role at NERC, coordinates a number of technical groups focused on inverter-based resources, distributed energy resources, integrating security with conventional engineering practices, and emerging technologies. Ryan has been deeply involved in the analysis of the PV disturbance events and in the formulation of recommendations for industry. He's become an internationally recognized expert in this area and is a regular participant at eSig. I feel very fortunate to have Ryan here with us today. I have to confess, I couldn't resist the temptation to take a look at our connections on LinkedIn last night. This was particularly interesting because I've done the same thing for the last 2 years when Ryan gave our December webinar. Our shared connections have continued to grow from 208 2 years ago to 256 last year and 306 this year. Ryan, I need to say it again. You need to be careful of the company you're keeping. Anyway, I consider Ryan a good friend and a good friend of eSig, and it's a pleasure working with him and having him here. The webinar will dive into the modeling issues and shortcomings associated with the present interconnection process. Ryan will highlight the key findings and lessons learned from the recent events and provide recommendations for what needs to be done to correct the situation. Recommendations that we all need to take seriously. I greatly value Ryan's contributions to eSig and the industry, and I look forward to what he has to say. Just a short reminder once again to use Slido at slido.com with the event code of eSig13 to ask your questions. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Ryan, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thanks again for the opportunity to present to the eSig members. I always really look forward to this chance to share, our findings and what we've been learning regarding inverter-based resources, particularly around the modeling topic. It's a very technical topic. We've been talking about it for 20 years, as Charlie said, and I really wanted to gear the presentation here more as a conversation and to share really just our thoughts and our findings, the things that I've come across in our event analysis activities, that my team has come across. We've got a really strong team in the inverter space now, and just looking forward to diving even further into all things related to IBR modeling and studies. It is really coming to the forefront of some of the challenges that we have to get a handle on here very quickly. So we really tried to gear the conversation towards industry practitioners, folks that are interconnecting these plants and need really pragmatic, practical guidance or help or support or whatever we can share with them to help in their endeavors of reliably integrating rapidly growing levels of inverter-based resources to the bulk power system. I should highlight that we're talking specifically about bulk power system connected IBRs here. This presentation, I think, has maybe one slide on DERs, but really that's a separate topic that we could talk at length about as well. So with that, I'll jump in. And as Charlie said, I get to save like 15 slides because Patrick did a wonderful job presenting on the 2022 Odessa event. But we just recently published the report last week. So the NERC disturbance report is officially out now. Again, very similar event that we saw in 2021 when we had the unexpected, notorious, infamous Odessa event. But we had a fault in that same general area. Multiple solar plants tripping or ceasing power consumption or production for whatever reason, multiple reasons, and then a number of synchronous generation facilities that also tripped off in addition to the solar PV resources. So this event was bigger. This event was the biggest widespread solar loss event, resource loss event we've seen in our endeavors to get a handle on the IBR topics. Solar amounting to about 1,700 megawatts and synchronous at about 800 megawatts. So the causes, which Patrick talked about on the last webinar, were inverter level AC overcurrent, inverter level phase jump tripping, which is a form of passive anti-islanding protection, inverter level instantaneous AC overvoltage protection, inverter level DC voltage imbalance, one plant with incorrect ride-through settings configured, and one plant going into momentary cessation, and a small number of unknown that we couldn't get the answers to for various reasons. What I want to highlight here is a lot of times I'll get the question of why aren't we getting a handle on this stuff? And I think what's interesting to highlight that you can see here is on the green, I tried to denote things that showed up in the last event that didn't show up in this event at all. And that's really a testament to ERCOT and their proactive interaction with the affected asset owners to eliminate those causes of potential tripping at those plants out there in that general area, right? So not only did we reduce it, we brought that to zero, and that's a tremendous amount of work that went in to make that happen. The red, you'll notice, are things that didn't show up in the 2021 report or event, and now are very prominent in the 2022 event, right? So there's these inverters and the inverter-based resources as a whole are sort of these onions, right? You pull back the layers of the onion, and under that you have more protections and more possible causes of abnormal performance and tripping. And so we continue to uncover things that are new that we didn't see. And, a lot of folks like to reference the Blue Cut fire, but that was just one item on this page here, right? All these other things were a compilation of things we've seen over the, gosh, we've lost count now, 12 or more events that we've analyzed and published reports on. I just like to highlight that our understanding is evolving. We're definitely, addressing real world issues by working with the affected asset owners, putting out the reports, working with the inverter manufacturers, the plant controller manufacturers, et cetera. But new things are still creeping up on us, and the goal is to mitigate them to the greatest extent we can. The other thing I want to highlight, again, lots of text on the screen here, but all those plots or all those plants, excuse me, in the red boxes are relatively new. I waved my hand and said somewhere around late 2020, I'll call relatively new. And you see a whole lot of megawatts in there. I forget exact numbers, but yeah, greater than 900 megawatts of I think installed capacity, or maybe even reduction. I forget how I added that up. And yeah, reduction, right? So almost 1,000 megawatts of reduction of plants that are pretty much brand new. And that's concerning, right? Because a lot of the California issues that we're seeing are legacy plants that are, upwards of 10 years old or more. And those issues tend to not be able to be fixed. And so we sort of live with that recurring problem, and that's a risk in and of itself. But these are really new plants, and they're really big plants. There's also that misconception that the plants involved, they were seeing hundreds of plants reducing output, and they're all 15 megawatts or 74 MVA to not meet the BES definition. And that's, while there are a lot of plants out there that are that size, they're not the ones that we see involved in these events. They're large, in some cases, multi-hundred megawatt facilities that are brand new. Why this is all important, and we talked about this in past reports, webinars, et cetera, is that the pace of growth of solar in ERCOT is tremendous. At the time, and you see the hashed out, the strike through numbers are the ones from the 2021 report, and the red numbers are the ones from the 2022 report. So in 1 year, you can see those changes from where we are. And I think what's most notable is that jump from 790 to 3,000 megawatts. And that's in commissioning at this moment, or at least at the time of publication of the report, right? So 8,600 capacity in ERCOT, 3,000 megawatts being commissioned right now, and upwards of almost 29,000 megawatts planned with signed interconnection agreements in service by the end of 2023, right? So that's a huge boom. Now that might extend out a little bit, et cetera, but that's where we are, and those numbers are going up, not down. So it sort of elevates the risk priority, elevates the need to put mitigations in place to address these challenges now, rather than when the penetration level is 3x or greater. So in the report we talk about modeling. There's a whole section, a whole chapter on modeling, actually, and I highly encourage everyone to take a look at the report. As we did with the last event, we continued that on with this report, and we asked the question: can these events, or can these causes of reduction, be accurately modeled in the positive sequence simulations and the EMT simulations? Now, if you're an academic or you're a researcher, et cetera, you can argue with me all day about this. That's fine. But I want to bring up the point. Blur your eyes. The left-hand column, you see quite a bit of no's and a whole lot of caveats. And the right-hand column, you see a whole lot of yeses and a very small amount of caveats. And that's just, can we get this right with these modeling platforms, right? Now that this is a very nuanced topic, and we argue all about it in working group meetings, et cetera. But at a high level, this is what we came up with. And now let's go a step further. Again, can those models recreate the causes of reduction we saw in the 2022 event? And look around that pie chart. There's a whole lot of no's, and those no's are on the big ones, right? And it has to do with the fact that it's instantaneous protections that happen, sub-cycle, sub-millisecond even, or protections that really aren't represented in the dynamic models available to transmission planners today for positive sequence, right? So there's that aspect of, well, no, I can't represent it. There are some yeses, and those are incorrect ride-through configuration. One could argue, well, that's probably no, actually, because you don't know that that's out there. and maybe momentary cessation. But we took it a step further and said, not can, but do the models recreate the cause of reduction, the positive sequence models? And in that regard, there's a few more no's and a lot more question marks. And I think it's worth noting also that all that synchronous generation that we lost is also a big no, right? Because we don't model transformer differential protection in positive sequence transmission planning studies generally. And we had a plant that was in a automatic voltage regulator, had a manual mode instead of an automatic, and it was unbeknownst to the plant operator because of some updated AVR settings. And so there's a lot of no's, right? Again, blur your eyes. The vast majority of that resource loss is unexpected. We rely on these models to plan, operate, and design a reliable bulk power system, but then we run into these types of issues where we're not seeing this in the planning studies that we conduct ahead of time to ensure reliable operation. So that's a challenge. We asked ERCOT the same question, and this is in no way a knock on ERCOT and their level of expertise, because in many ways they're in front of a whole lot of entities to try to get a handle on this stuff. But we asked that same question: do your models can they recreate this event? And they provided this table back, entirely unknown, right? Then it has to do with, for the EMT, for example, I don't know what's in the model. It's black box and I can't see it and I don't know what's in there. And in the positive sequence, I don't know if it could recreate it because again, we can't represent a whole lot of those causes of tripping. We're not even sure we can represent the causes of reduction that could be potentially represented. So there's a lot of difficulties there, and their answer was a blanket unknown, right? But it's a challenge. It's again, not a knock, it's a challenge that we have today. So with that kind of background, I wanted to go into some recommendations. So me and my team, we've been working to try to get our thoughts down and ultimately get them out on paper here relatively soon. But I put together 8 recommendations or takeaways that I wanted to walk through with you all. The first one being, there's a notable growing need for EMT studies, for interconnecting and assessing inverter-based resource performance. I've used this graphic for a number of years now. Love to let people argue about the different spokes that are connecting to the graphic. But again, if you're a transmission planner, you can look around the wheel here and one of those things is going to stand out. And this is not you have to have all of them to do EMT. This is any one of these things could cause you to need to do EMT, right? And so this is really just growing as we interconnect more and more inverter-based resources to the bulk power system. So what have we been doing? Well, we have a standard authorization or a standard drafting team that's now being stood up. I think that was actually maybe the drafting team members were endorsed or approved, I think today. So we've got activities starting to incorporate EMT modeling and studies into the NERC Mod 32, TPL1, and FACT2 reliability standards. And then we're very, very near putting out a reliability guideline on EMT modeling for BPS connected IBRs, particularly around modeling requirements and then model quality verification processes. And that should be going out here very shortly for a 45-day industry comment, and then hopefully getting approved and published in March. So we're trying to really do a lot in this area. And I'll actually come back to that here in a bit. So what are the takeaways from all this stuff? We need to establish EMT modeling requirements now, not later. And we've heard that from around the world, where I wish I had that model earlier at the time of interconnection, because now the plant has changed hands 5 times or the OEM's out of business and there's no way I could get a good model for this plant. So establish those EMT modeling requirements now for all newly interconnecting IBRs. And I'd even take that further and say all the newly interconnecting generation. The details in those requirements matter tremendously. They need to be clear, consistent, explicit, and detailed so that the interconnecting customer, the OEM, the consultants, et cetera, know the expectations of the type of model and the level of detail that's in that model. That should include the control modes, the settings, the protection systems, anything that affects the electrical output of the facility. Next, establish EMT modeling checks now, not later. And we've seen that in the reports where, for example, as reported in the disturbance reports, ERCOT has had EMT modeling requirements for many years now. But it wasn't until more recently that they established model quality checks and tests. So there's this period where models are being provided, but not really checked, at least not rigorously. And so a lot of those models don't include most of the causes of most of the protections that would trip the facility, either in the inverters or in the collector systems, et cetera. And so those models don't show that the plant is going to trip off every single time you have a fault, or this, in this vicinity, that plant's going to disconnect and that model doesn't show it, right? Something to highlight here that we've come across from a couple entities is that model quality does not equal the plant performing appropriately for the interconnected location. Those are two very different things that need to be differentiated through the process. And I think I have more slides on that, so I'll hold off talking about that any further. Enforce those model quality checks during the interconnection study process. You need good models to run studies. You need to have sufficient documentation to ensure model quality, and you need to integrate all of this into the commissioning activity, because there's this handoff that happens at commissioning that really doesn't include modeling. And so there's minimal true up is what the term I've used, to make sure that what I actually studied during that interconnection process is actually what's being connected. And there's a big gap. And even though OEMs will generally recognize that, yeah, the folks doing the commissioning are not the folks that do the modeling, and they don't even talk to each other. And that's a big gap that we have. And the last part of the EMT modeling is to start developing processes for when EMT studies need to be conducted. And that's actually in the SAR that was proposed and is in the standard drafting team activities now. Not that EMT studies necessarily need to be done for every interconnecting resource, but we need to know where and when to conduct those more detailed studies when they're needed. Examples are pockets of very high IBR conditions, low short circuit strength areas, et cetera. So the next takeaway, so I'm going to jump now out of the EMT space and focus on positive sequence models here for a second. So there's that question, do we still need positive sequence models? That keeps coming up. And I think there's a resounding yes. We still need the positive sequence models. It's not like we're going to abandon them today or anytime soon. We still rely on those types of models for interconnection-wide assessments, the creation of interconnection-wide base cases, and the difficulties that we have right now with doing large-scale EMT studies. So there's still a significant need to have high quality, accurate, verified positive sequence models in addition to EMT models. And so folks ask, well, what do you prefer? Standard library model, often referred to as a generic model, which is a term that I don't like, or a user-defined model? And I think the answer that we've held strong to is require both, and then benchmark them across each other, because they serve different purposes. Right, a local interconnection study at the time of interconnection, a local reliability assessment conducted in TPL studies should be using that detailed user-defined model. Right? But maybe for the creation of interconnection-wide base cases where all the regions have to put their models together to create that interconnection-wide case, there may be, and there sort of is, a solidly justified reason why you don't stick a bunch of UDMs in those models, because those UDMs break or don't work or cause problems. So if I'm a planner in the SPP footprint, I don't want to deal with a model that's breaking in Maine. It's too far away, and I honestly don't care about it, right? But it can cause my whole case to blow up on me. And so those issues are quite pervasive, and I don't feel personally that we've got a good handle on base case creation and model quality to really start injecting user-defined models into the base cases everywhere. Now, some entities do interconnection-wide base case modeling with user-defined models like ERCOT. They're a single planning coordinator entity, and they have enough resourcing and good processes to flag those bad models and address those issues. But when you're talking about a region with tens or hundreds of entities submitting models, it becomes a problem. Another misconception that I really want to clear up here is that folks will point to the NERC acceptable model list, which is linked to mod 32 and mod 2627, and they'll say that doesn't allow me to use UDM. That requires standard library models, and that statement is flat out wrong. Nowhere in there does it say that the acceptable model list precludes you from using a UDM. It does not preclude you from using a UDM. And we're actively updating that acceptable model list in the overall way that gets portrayed to clarify this, because it comes up fairly regularly, which essentially means no one's reading the footnotes or the fine print. that says exactly that, right? What's most important is that the model matches the actual equipment installed in the field. Fundamental point, right? That's what we need out there with these models. So far, as I say, I had to bold it, or I had to put it red and put it on 2 separate slides just to highlight that point, right? So the next takeaway here is quality of these models, right? Quality to me is the accuracy, the fidelity, the usability, the efficiency of that model, and we need it to match the actual equipment in the field. Mod 26 and 27 are undergoing a significant revision right now. And what we had identified, years ago was that those small disturbance tests that are required in Mod 26, 27 do not lead you to a validated, accurate model across the board, right? They validate or verify certain parameters, but not the model as a whole. So using a certain model or a model that's on the acceptable model list does not mean that model is accurate. And we see that with default parameters that are being used across the industry, right? Pull up an interconnection-wide base case, and you're going to see dozens and dozens or hundreds of plants with exactly the same parameters. And you go talk to any OEM, and they say, no two plants should have the same parameters because every plant gets tuned for its local interconnection, right? So there's a big deficiency right there, and we did some work back in 2020 looking at that. We put out a report on that, and we're looking at doing that same thing again, kind of as an update to what we found. Default, in my mind, a blanket statement here, and again, I'm trying to move quick, but default to me means matching exactly what's in the standard software package manuals, which you see very, very commonly. Matching the default OEM settings, meaning they weren't trued up at the time of commissioning. Matching other OEM models, models of that same OEM or different OEMs. Again, matching a whole bunch of other plants nearby. Or, and this is maybe not a default, but parameter values that were simply just curve fit, but don't actually relate to any actual plant. We've heard from multiple sources that that's pretty common to meet compliance obligations for the interconnection process. So these genericized models, the defaults, parameters, et cetera, are making their way into the interconnection-wide base cases, and you can pull up an interconnection-wide base case and see that pretty regularly. These standard library models are much more common than the UDMs. Because they're easier to use, they're easier to meet compliance with the interconnection process, they're easier to explain. But most OEMs will say we prefer the user-defined model. In our mind, it's much more accurate to reflect our equipment, but we're going to do whatever the minimum requirements or obligations require of us. Takeaway number 4, really briefly here, is take that model quality check seriously to sort of try to avoid what was on that last slide. We need to establish model quality checks industry-wide, and that's in a few of the SARs that are going through to sort of bring that into the NERC standards. That not only do we need models and create base cases, but we need those models to be accurate, and we need proof of that. We need to know that the model matches what's out there in the field. That could involve things like attestations from the OEMs, validation reports, again, from the OEMs, factory acceptance tests, hardware in the loop testing, attestations from the generator owner and or the consultant regarding how that plant model was put together, documentation of as-built settings, some type of change management process or version control, commissioning activities that are dedicated to modeling, and that true-up activity that really needs to take place during the commissioning process with the transmission planner or the planning individual or organization present and involved in that activity, which, as we hear pretty widely around the industry, is not the case today. But it was the case many, many, many years ago when we were not connecting hundreds and hundreds of plants in one year. We were connecting a small handful or a dozen or a couple, something like that. Number 5, the model quality versus plant performance. I mentioned this earlier, but those two things need to be differentiated. You cannot say that the model quality is the same as the plant performance, because I could have a perfectly performing model and that works really well in my system, but it doesn't match reality. So when you connect to the plant's doing something completely different. And folks will say, as long as the model is doing what I want it to do, everything's fine, right? That's the problem that we have here today, is that the models don't match what's actually in the field, which is what a quality, accurate model is, right? So don't conflate the two. Checking plant performance makes sure that you have a reliable system and that plant reliably operates in that system, but it doesn't mean your model's right. And so mixing those is a major problem. We've been told, even so far as to say, we've been told explicitly, model quality tests are not supposed to check model accuracy. They check plant performance, which is, in my mind, is just wild. I don't know where that idea comes from, to be frank. But that whole concept of combining plant performance as the same as model quality actually incentivizes the developers, the generator owners, the OEMs even, to just provide a model that looks good. Doesn't actually be right. It just needs to pass the tests so that I can interconnect my plant. And we hear that from the OEMs, from the consultants, et cetera, saying, I'm being pressured by my developer to just give them a model that works. It doesn't have to be right. Everything's going to change anyways. Just give me the best thing you got that meets the requirements. And that's what's causing these problems. So differentiate these steps, make sure that we sort of true that up. Here are, so takeaway 6 is these issues are pervasive. I've said that many times. They come in many different shapes and sizes, different facilities, different locations across the industry. Different owner operators, different OEMs, different consultants. It's really common to see this stuff all across the board. So I put a couple examples here. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but let's go through a couple. Example 1, the plant was having some voltage tripping issues. The OEM comes in, they model the whole thing in detail. They replicate the tripping with some detailed limiter logic in the inverter in the plant controller. And that OEM provides a verified site-specific user-defined model to the developer, both in EMT and in positive sequence. And the customer being the interconnection customer, the developer, turns around and submits a standard library model to the TP. And they're told, well, it's much easier to get the TPPC approval, and we just need to start making megawatts. That's how we make money. So the model is irrelevant. There's one example. Example number 2, site-specific site plant verification, right? OEM provided a site-specific verified model, both in EMT and in positive sequence, and a standard library model parameterized with wave your hands, best guess mapping, no simulations, just assumptions made, was what was submitted to the TP because the template that's used to submit those models uses a standard library model as the example, right? They maybe don't say you can't supply a UDM, but their template has a standard library model on it, so the developer assumes I got to submit that model. That's what's required of me, right? So they throw out the good model and they submit a guess model, a best guess model. A best guess model is wrong. It needs to be verified. Example number 3, complex site with multiple OEMs and a third-party PPC. These are not that uncommon anymore in today's interconnections. Detailed EMT, detailed UDM was provided for positive sequence by the OEM that matched the site design. And again, a standard library model is submitted with no coordination between the controllers, no parameter verification. And again, it comes down to it's super easy to pass the TP requirements using a standard library model. And you don't need to do any verification checks of actual equipment settings to pass those requirements. So why bother with the detailed UDM model? There's a couple other examples down there that I won't spend much time on, but they're there, and there's many others. But hopefully that gives you a flavor of the types of things that we've come across. Takeaway 7, the interconnection studies using default models, in my mind, are as good as useless for reliability, because you're not going to pick up things like failure to ride through disturbances or unreliable operation issues like controller instability or controller interactions, or the inability to provide essential reliability services like voltage control. You miss those things when you use genericized or standardized models that are ultimately not reflecting the as-built facilities. Make sure to check the model quality throughout the interconnection process. It's recognized that when you go through that interconnection process, it's extremely complicated. You start at that initial request, you don't know much as a developer, and then as you go through the process, you go into your system impact study, and that's where the bulk of the study work gets done. But what we've heard so many times, particularly from transmission planners, is that, yeah, when we conduct our system impact study, they haven't picked their inverters, or they haven't picked their manufacturers, and so we just use generics. And then so you follow that up with, well, do you restudy that or reassess them down the road? Oh, no, 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 of course not. We don't have the time to do that. We have to meet obligations, and so we allow them to connect. Then why did you run the system impact study in the first place? Because you're using model parameters that don't actually show what the plant's actually going to do when interconnected. And that's a big problem right now. We have that across the board pretty heavily, I'd say, where we're running studies, given the current process that we have, and we aren't truing up down the road to make sure that it matches what actually gets installed, and to flag it when it doesn't and say, someone's got to restudy this. Someone's got to make sure that when that plant closes the breaker, it's going to reliably operate through a fault, which is why we have all these big events. And the last takeaway, while we see a lot of attention on solar, this is happening across the board. We published a couple wind events, and I'll mention here in a minute, but we're working on a battery energy storage event, set of events that we're analyzing in the Western Interconnection. Here's a good example. It's out of the Panhandle Wind Disturbance Report that we published, I think, earlier this year. The top plot shows high-speed oscillography data at the POI. In the real world, when the fault occurs, power goes to zero after fault clearing, right? So you see here, current goes up, voltage goes down, single line to ground fault. And after fault clearing, after voltage kind of recovers, power drops to zero out of the wind plant. And it slowly recovers over a few hundred milliseconds. And there's an EMT study that was conducted. This plant is a new facility, underwent extensive EMT studies by a highly reputable EMT shop. Got their, obviously their interconnection transient stability studies done with positive sequence. The EMT studies showed some variation in the recovery time, either delayed or too quick. So the model wasn't exactly matching, but it showed this general trend, right? We'll take that positive sequence model that you can pull right out of the base case, which is what's submitted in the latest and greatest dynamics files that are available. And the plant snaps right back up to active power right when the fault clears and settles pretty quickly, right? This response really should look like that. Right? This is only hundreds of milliseconds, 200 milliseconds per division. So it wouldn't be something drastic, but it would be a recovery that looks something like this. It wouldn't be it doesn't match what you see here, right? It's just one example, but this model, even though a detailed EMT study was done, these models don't match each other. They weren't benchmarked across each other, so this model is wrong and it needs to be updated. Right? So I've only got a couple more minutes, but I wanted to highlight a couple of the things that we're doing on the NERC side. As I mentioned, we are sort of done admiring the problem, and we're really focused on developing mitigations to address these risks. We've brought on some extremely highly qualified individuals onto my team now that are tackling this head on. I'm excited to see what we do in the coming year. So I want to just walk through some of the things that we're up to. So we recently published an inverter-based resource strategy document. I won't go through it in detail, but the link that is there at the bottom. And if you just go onto the NERC website in the top right, you'll see an initiatives tab. Under the initiatives tab, you'll see inverter-based resource initiative as well as a DER initiative. And under there, you'll see the strategy document. And it's quite a good read, I think. It's quick to the point, kind of explains what we're up to. And really, there's 4 pillars: risk analysis, improvements to the interconnection processes, sharing best practices and education and outreach with the industry, and then the regulatory enhancements. So you can see a whole lot of things going on. I would say all of these things are actively being pursued at this moment with a whole lot of content coming out in each of those pillars right now. We did the same thing with the DER strategy. Here's my one slide for DERs. Similar look and pillar structure, but we've got a DER modeling, a studies, and operational impacts, and a regulatory considerations set of pillars for the DER activities. And our NERC Spider WG group is extremely active and successful in trying to tackle these issues with guidance materials, standards enhancements, etc. So a lot of things going on the DER space. I mentioned we keep analyzing these events as they happen. The spring and early summertime are always the exciting times where if we're going to have an event in the year, they seem to pop up at that time. So we're kind of in a lull now, and we'll see what happens this upcoming spring. It'd be very interesting to see what happens in the Texas footprint, because ERCOT has done a tremendous job mitigating those risk issues for the affected asset owners, as well as communicating with the other asset owners in their footprint. And so we'll see what happens now and into the future, but they need to be recognized for the great work they've done. We continue to see events in California. A lot of that is legacy facilities, and a lot of work has been done there too, to try to mitigate some of the issues that can be addressed. But we are working, like I mentioned, on a battery energy storage related set of events that we've seen this year, and we're just now getting into the analysis after we got the 2022 Odessa report off our plate. So more to come there. I mentioned we're ramping up the EMT activities. We've got the SAR for standards enhancements. We've got the guideline. We're also looking at kicking off an EMT task force here very soon. The goal of that task force is to provide a forum and community for transmission planners and planning coordinators and industry at large that are trying to tackle this rapidly growing need to model and study using EMT platforms. And then we're also looking at kicking off a joint initiative with IEEE, Power and Energy Society. We've jointly sort of said this is a high priority issue we need to get our hands on. And so let's leverage the greater IEEE community. And one thing I'm excited about is maybe sharing international best practices through that forum. And of course, we can collaborate that with ESIG Reliability Working Group as well. We are looking at issuing at least one, maybe multiple NERC alerts, probably level 2 NERC alerts, to put out strong industry recommendations regarding specific actions that registered entities can take. And the two topics that we are looking to address are the performance risk issues. So the things like the tripping, the controller interactions, inverter performance issues, and then separately a modeling alert looking at recommended modeling practices, and then exploring and getting an understanding of the models that are out there today, both positive sequence and EMT. So the purpose of the alert really is to provide recommendations out to industry, but then also to gather data back on the NERC side so that we can understand the extent of condition for some of these risk issues. We have multiple standards projects underway. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can see all those listed projects. There's a couple future projects. Both of those SARs were approved at the recent Reliability and Security Technical Committee meeting and are headed for the Standards Committee. If not already, we're at the Standards Committee. So a number of projects related to IBRs and also a number of projects related to distributed energy resources. So Spider WG just got a white paper approved going through the standards, highlighting standards that need revision related to DERs. And you can see the sub-bullets there are those standards that are actively being pursued in terms of revisions. I'd be remiss to ignore or not mention the FERC directives that just came out regarding IBR registration, as well as NERC standards enhancements to address what's interesting there is to address BES IBRs, to address non-BES bulk power system connected IBRs, as well as IBR distributed energy resources. All of those are included in the directive. And so they've given us some timelines on getting back to them with a work plan, particularly around the registration. And there's currently a NOPR out for industry comment regarding standards enhancements. So we'll see where that ultimately lands. So I just close out by highlighting, this is our NERC risk management framework. It's in our biannual risk report. And I really like it because if you look at the inner blue boxes there, right, really what we do is we identify risk and validate that they're a real concern. Then we prioritize them against all the other things that we've got to deal with. We then determine appropriate mitigations and remediations. We then try to deploy those mitigations. We then measure success of how we're doing, and then we monitor for residual risk, right? Trying to see, does that issue pop back up? And all of this is done, within NERC, within the ERO enterprise, NERC in the regions, and then working collaboratively with industry stakeholders and industry forum groups like ESIG and many others. But this is all done, very collaboratively and transparently in my mind. Where we are, folks will ask, well, where are you on the IBR, risk issue? And it's hard to say where you are exactly on here because, as we've talked about, there's so many nuances and details to this risk Are we talking about modeling? Are we talking about performance issues? Are we talking about ride through? Are we talking about stability? Are we talking about the variability or uncertainty? Are we talking about resource adequacy? Are we talking about cybersecurity? The list goes on and on, really, right? And each one of those are somewhere different on this risk management framework. But when you look at kind of across the board, and again, you kind of blur your eyes, you're seeing that we're moving from identifying the risk and validating it and prioritizing it into developing mitigations and actually deploying those mitigations. So we have deployed many mitigations working with the OEMs to highlight the issues we've seen, and we don't see those issues anymore. We sort of fixed that back on the other slide that I mentioned. But then new issues pop up, and we start back at the beginning of identifying that issue and trying to work our way through the deployment phase and into the measuring success and then monitoring residual risk conditions, right? So as a whole, we're moving in the right direction on this. While we've had some really big events, there's a whole lot of positive work that's been done out there in the industry. Modeling is a big one. We really need to get our hands on accurate, verified, validated models so we can really trust those planning studies that are done to keep the grid safe, secure, and reliable moving forward. So I think that's all I got. Happy to take questions. And thanks for your time.
Okay, Ryan, it looks like with all those things that you're dealing with, you've got job security for a while to come.
I think we all do.
Yeah. There's been a lot of questions. We'll just jump right into them and try to go in order of priority for the most part here. So the one that popped to the top, did any of the mitigation measures and corrective actions, such as changing inverter settings, implemented after the 2021 event, contribute to the 2022 event?
Yeah, let me go back slides here. The table. This is a good one. So in the 2021 event, this was the number one cause of reduction, PLO loss of synchronism, one manufacturer. And we worked pretty closely with that OEM during the event and recognized that that protection could be disabled. You know, we asked, what is that protecting? And the answer was, after really detailed analysis by the OEM, that, well, it's not protecting anything. There are other forms of protection that will keep the inverter safe. But that one was the one that was preempting all the tripping. So it sort of seemed, you've got an unnecessary protection, it's not doing anything, and it causes spurious tripping in your inverter. So let's go ahead and disable that. So they did a bunch of analysis and they disabled it. And so what happens? Instantaneous AC overcurrent, AC over voltage, and this passive anti-islanding phase jump protection are right behind it to trip the inverters. And we actually speculated or thought that might happen, but we really needed some real world data to prove it. Because when we see these inverters trip, we also see them flagging on all these forms of protection. So I think it was a positive that we got rid of an unnecessary protection. But the downfall is that there were 3 or 4 other forms of protection right behind it, ready to trip the inverter as well. This sort of proved that that was exactly the case. So the OEM, and it's documented in the disturbance report pretty well, but the OEMs have gone through and developed mitigations for most of these new issues as well. And now it's a matter of rolling those out to the fleet at large. And then that's the work that's going on right now. So that's one example. The other example I'd highlight is that you will often, and we added some asterisks this time, to sort of differentiate. If you add up this column, it doesn't add up to 1711, which is the total resource loss. It adds up to a larger amount because a lot of these you'll see the inverters all trip, but then also feeder level protection also trips. And so if you're just fixing the feeder level protection issue, you're maybe not fixing the inverter level issue. So the next event, it's also just going to trip again. Right. So I just highlight both of those things as a couple of examples.
Did you ever feel like you missed your calling, Ryan, and you should have been an FBI investigator?
this is the most fun that I get to have. This is definitely when an event, I like the events. I probably shouldn't say that publicly, but they keep the work very exciting. So
Yes, for sure. Uh, Question here from Harry Singh. If unacceptable IBR trips are predominantly due to protection settings within the IBR plant, isn't this a PRC 19 issue for GOs? Why put the onus on TPs to uncover them?
yeah, good question. Thanks, Harry. I think one could argue it's a PRC 19 issue that's coordination of controls, limiters, and protections. But in a lot of these cases, you would say that the inverters are protecting themselves. They experience the trip threshold and they don't have a limiter that's going to keep them from tripping on, say, phase jump or something like that. So they're simply just tripping, right? Why put the onus on the TPs? I don't think there really is an onus on the TPs. There is an onus on TPs to plan a reliable system looking forward. And so that onus needs to be put back onto the developer / generator owner to provide a model that can be used to assess that reliable performance in the future. We actually did just have a SAR get endorsed by the NERC RSTC, which is now headed to the standards committee, which is a complement to PRC4. And for those that aren't familiar, PRC4 is the standard that says if I have a misoperation of a protection system, let's say I'm a transmission entity and I have a protective relay on a transmission line that misoperates, I'm required by the standard to go in, figure out what happened, and fix it. I can't ignore that misoperation. I have to go fix that misoperation and report it. The problem comes down to, well, what's the definition of protection system, yada, yada, yada. What we found is that no entities on the IBR side are analyzing abnormal performance and mitigating that abnormal performance. And so the new SAR, which is proposing a new standard, new NERC standard, really addresses that head on. And it says when a generator owner of an IBR facility, I think all facilities, but a generator owner identifies abnormal performance within their plant, they're required to analyze it, mitigate it, and report it to the entity, the balancing authority, the transmission operator, and the reliability coordinator. So that standard will drive proactive mitigation of reliability issues. Because if you ignore those unexpected trippings, you are potentially non-compliant with that standard. That standard does give the authority to the transmission side reliability coordinator, balancing authority, and TOP that if they see abnormal performance per the interconnection requirements, the market rules, whatever those obligations are on that entity, that they can invoke that analysis to take place. I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle too, because in most of these events, when we show up to the asset owner and say, hey, we'd like to have a call with you to talk about what we saw, a lot of folks are not aware that anything had happened because the inverters will automatically reconnect 5 to 7 minutes later and back to business as usual. And they don't really grasp the fact that, gosh, we had 15, 20 other plants all do exactly the same thing. And this is a fairly big reliability risk, right? So that new proposed standard, I think, could go a very long way in helping shore up these type of issues before they boil up to really big, reliability risks.
Okay, thank you. We haven't said much about grid forming versus grid following, but here's a question that popped up from Russ Philbrick. Can we reduce the need for EMT studies by replacing grid following with grid forming inverters to provide traditional services?
I don't know. The grid forming topic is I'll say too sensitive. We're struggling with the models. We don't really have any grid forming products in North America that are bulk power system, large scale products, grid connected, GFM BES or GFM solar, whatever it might be. So I would say it's speculation at this point to say, well, do we need EMT studies or not? Or do we need more? Do we need less? My hunch is we'll need just as many, if not more, because it's going to require extremely detailed representation of that controller. And I want the model that's coming directly from the inverter manufacturer, not a generic model that's making broad assumptions of what the plant may or could or maybe is doing based on some fundamental expectation of what grid forming is. I want what's actually programmed in that device. And so for that, I'm likely going to need a user-defined positive sequence model and an EMT model and proof that they match each other.
Yeah. Okay. An OEM question. Speaking of OEMs, could you comment on why this time NERC decided to name the inverter OEM in the Odessa 2022 disturbance report?
That's a good question. We're documenting what we see. We provided an objective review of what we found in the event, and we thought it important to highlight those entities that were involved with and that were involved in the disturbance. I will recognize, and it's in the report, that we had extensive, detailed conversations with those OEMs, and there are fixes being implemented to many of the tripping issues that we've seen right now, right? So it's not that these OEMs were involved in the event and, you know, shame on you. It's that these OEMs were involved in the event and have fixes to the performance issues, but we need to make sure that the asset owners know that if I've got inverters by this OEM, I need to request that fix. I need that fix, and I need that implemented quickly, to sort of address those reliability issues. It's also worthwhile for the transmission planners to know, hey, if I'm interconnecting these devices, I want to make sure that that latest firmware doesn't have these types of problems, and that the dynamic models, the EMT models in particular, reflect that and prove that they're not going to trip on these causes of reduction. So
yeah, I think that's a reasonable and good answer. A question from Chase Sun. Who is responsible for validating the accuracy of the model of the installed systems? Local utility, ISO, NERC? Does the utility know what to check?
Yeah, Chase, good question. I don't know exactly what model of the installed systems is, but, I think, the generator owner / developer, et cetera, will be responsible for providing a validated, verified model with sufficient documentation to prove that. I think we need to get past this. I'm a planner. It's not my responsibility to care about the model quality. I heard that growing up. That it's the asset owner's job to make sure they have a validated model. That's not true. It's the transmission planner's job to care about the quality of their model for their full system. Now we have Mod 33 system model validation. Great. You do it for one event every 2 years and you get to pick the event you want. So is that really going to validate your whole system? No. Let's just be honest there. Right. So you do need to care about the quality of those incoming models, establish those requirements, make sure that they're met, etc., so that when you're using those models to run your studies, they're reasonable. Now you have to put a lot of those into requirements so that the onus does go back on the asset owner, the generator owner, who's going to then put that onus on the OEMs and the consultants that they hire to put these models together. And when you talk to the OEMs and the consultants, they'll tell you, just tell us and we'll get it right. But in a lot of cases, these requirements are vague or non-existent, etc. So we're really trying to hammer the need for clear, concise, and consistent requirements in the interconnection process and in the planning process.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in a couple more questions. We're getting close on time. So, given the importance of EMT studies, do you think it would be in the interest of NERC to mandate those studies under certain conditions?
I would say that's essentially in the EMT SAR that now has a drafting team addressing it, right? Is to gather models, make sure those models are of good quality, and to identify when and where to conduct studies, and then to conduct those studies appropriately, right? So that's what's at least proposed in the current SAR. We'll see where that standard drafting team goes and how the industry, accepts that standard. But I think that's where we're headed. I think we're headed in the right direction.
Okay, a question on the report. Is the report readily available? Could you provide a link? We can deal with that in the follow-up, Ryan.
Yep.
And do you plan a webinar on distributed generation renewable IB? Our impact, I guess that's a question for ESIG, and we have not, don't have one on the schedule, but I think we'll, after this discussion, to take a look at adding one.
Maybe I'll add a plug, Charlie. JP Skeeth from our team, is actually holding a DER workshop tomorrow. So if you're interested, you can go to the NERC calendar. Just go to NERC.com. There's a calendar, and you'll see a link to tomorrow's workshop. And they're going to talk about all things DER and what the Spider WG has been up to in terms of putting out materials to the industry. So feel free to listen into that.
Great. Yeah, the Spider working group has done a lot of stuff in the last year. That's a good resource. This will be the last question. So how much did IEEE 1547 2018 help reduce the level of inverter trips?
So that standard is applicable only to distributed energy resources connected to the distribution system. Everything that I've talked about here is bulk power system connected IBRs, where I'll put it bluntly, 1547 has no business being involved. And that was a misconception that lived for many, many years until the Blue Cut fire. And we went through this whole analysis and discussion with UL and the certification organizations that put the stamp, the 1547 stamp, and they said, this isn't a conflict. It may be a perceived conflict, but there's no conflict here. And ultimately, what led us down the path of needing IEEE 2800-2022. So saying that, 1547-2018 actually has helped because it requires those DERs to ride through events and be much more robust to, you know, large voltage perturbations, et cetera. And so in California, which has quite a bit of legacy DERs, when we have a fault, we see, you know, upwards of a couple hundred megawatts of DERs trip offline. Those are mostly, you know, our speculation is those are legacy inverters that are 1547 whatever 2004 or whatever compliant. And in that environment, it was when you see the grid hiccup get off. And 2018 really brought us a long way on the distribution side to have more robust devices down there. So it is helping. It has helped, but it doesn't help with regard to the stuff we talked about here today.
I want to extend this with one related question, Ryan, that's through a couple of the subsequent inputs there in the Q&A, and that is the role of P2800. Have you seen any impacts of that yet?
I think industry is still, you know, going through the adoption phases of 2800, which is to be expected. There's a very active group referred to as DOT2, which is the testing and verification activities to show conformance to 2800. And you sort of need that to be able to say, you know, do you meet 2800, yes or no? But even without that, utilities are still, you know, headed down the path of figuring out how to implement 2800. And NERC has taken a pretty active stance, in our opinion, on that. So far as recommending in the FERC Interconnections NOPR that we support the adoption of 2800 and would like to see that you know, implemented somehow. Now the question turns to, well, should there be a NERC standard, all that stuff. The folks that are recommending a NERC standard are not the folks that have to deal with the legal implications of that. The folks that have to deal with the legal implications of that say, no way, that would never go to NERC standard. So it's a very complicated, nuanced subject when you really have to take a step back and think about how the best way to adopt 2800 is. Some entities are piecemeal adopting it. Some entities are blanket adopting it. Some entities are just pulling the language right out of the standard and putting it in their requirements. There's many different ways that industry is adopting that. I think over time, maybe we'll unify, but I think all that stuff is headed in the right direction, and 2800 is serving a very valuable purpose and being an extremely useful tool to have better interconnections by establishing those, you know, clear requirements.
Okay, I think the discussion has been very valuable. We're a little bit over, but I wish we had another half hour, but we're going to need to wrap it up. I want to thank Ryan for this really compelling presentation, and I hope all of you take his call to action seriously, as the reliability of the bulk power system simply cannot be compromised. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the video file has been posted, and we'll answer the questions we didn't get to and get them posted as quickly as possible and provide the link to the report. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you again soon at our next webinar series starting in January and our spring workshop in Tucson at the end of March. Further information on all of the webinars and meetings can be found on our website at esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails, and you're all invited to attend. Ryan, thank you once again for this really great webinar, and thanks to all of you for your engagement. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future. In the meantime, everyone, happy holidays. Take care, stay safe, and thanks for your participation. See you soon.
Thanks, Charlie. Happy holidays, everyone.